we're interested in extremist political movements of left and right, and within a range of faith communities. My starting point looking at any extremist movement is to take it on its own terms, to understand its philosophical basis, and to try to see the world through the eyes of its adherents. And that's a really important thing to do if you're going to make sense of how its supporters understand the world. By and large, on their own terms, extremist philosophies generally make sense. They are internally coherent, notwithstanding that they are wrong and potentially damaging. Now, philosophical coherence is not a term that anybody would readily apply to QAnon. Its essential claim is that the world is controlled by... Okay, somebody out there has their microphone on. Could you switch your microphones off if you're not speaking? Thank you. Philosophical coherence is not a term that anybody really would apply to QAnon, because its essential claim is that the world is controlled by a cabal of Satan-worshipping paedophiles who are running a global child sex trafficking ring and plotting against Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, in turn, is planning a day of reckoning called The Storm, where thousands of members of the cabal will be dealt with. The source of this supposed information is the mysterious Q, who is supposed to be somebody who has access to classified information and therefore be in the know. What's interesting about the QAnon thesis is that Q doesn't provide facts. Q merely drops clues. And like all good conspiracy theories, the absence of supporting evidence is itself evidence of the power of the conspiracy. So, getting to grips with QAnon is a very different sort of task from looking at, say, Marxist or Islamist or identitarian extremist groups. Instead of focusing on their theories, you need to look at three things. First of all, who their supporters are. Secondly, how their theories spread. Thirdly, what the real-world impact of this particular brand of conspiracism will be. And those are the topics up for discussion today. Let me just pause for a minute, because there are some people who've got who are having conversations on their phones, so I'm going to mute them. Great, I think that's dealt with. So we're going to look at those three topics today. Now, at one time, we might have asked, why does any of this matter? And one answer is that QAnon conspiracism has moved from the fringes to the mainstream. For example, it's likely that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has expressed support for aspects of QAnon beliefs, will be elected as a Republican to Congress in January. We're lucky to have a panel consisting of two prominent academics with deep expertise in extremist politics and the spread of conspiracism through the internet. I expect many of you will know and respect them already from their analysis of other fringe political movements. They are Dr. Daniel Allington, the Senior Lecturer in Social and Cultural Artificial Intelligence at King's College London, and Professor Matthew Feldman, Professorial Fellow at the University of York, who is also the Director of the Centre for the Analysis of the Radical Right. And we're going to turn to them in that order in a moment, where you will hear their preliminary take on the subject. We'll have a general discussion around these themes. But before we start, a little housekeeping. First of all, as I've said many times before, on the last four webinars we've done, we've moved from Zoom to WebEx, and we did that because we were concerned about reports of data transmission to China, which might have meant that the Chinese Communist Party would have access to our information. WebEx, as I've said before, does much of what Zoom does, but as we've all discovered, there's one flaw, which is that I cannot prevent you from turning your microphone and camera on. Can I ask you, therefore, unless you're called on to ask a question, to turn these off and not to turn them on? Secondly, the most interesting part of any webinar are the questions and answers. Please use the chat button on your screen to ask your questions in writing, and I'll then call on you to ask your question. You're going to need to unmute your microphone, and if you're very brave, you can turn your camera on as well if I call on you. But until you're called, please keep your microphone and camera off. Finally, these webinars are free, but they do cost us money. So if you are not a member of the Quilliam Circle already, can I encourage all of you to join? The donations that come through Quilliam Circle go directly to support these sorts of seminars. I've acquired 2 studio lights, which means that you're not viewing me in Stygian gloom tonight. And that was only possible because people were prepared to pay a monthly amount to keep Quilliam going. So I think all of you have received an email telling you about how WebEx works. I've given you the preliminary introduction. I've given you some words about how to make sure you don't accidentally unmute yourself. Now on to the topic of the day. Daniel, shall we start with you? Tell us about QAnon.
Okay, well, I mean, the first thing, I suppose, how long should I speak for, by the way, David?
10 minutes would be fine.
Okay. I mean, the first thing to realize about QAnon is that all of the aspects, pretty much all of the aspects of QAnon's belief system are things that we've heard before. It's monumentally plagiaristic, as is the whole of conspiracist culture online. One of the most notable things about conspiracy theories, you would think that if you just hear the word conspiracy theory, you would think of this as being like, I don't know, scientific theories, that people notice something going on and they try to find an explanation, which is there was a conspiracy. But really, conspiracy theories are a sort of a mythology or a folklore that's based around very, very similar motifs that keep resurfacing again and again in new conspiracy theories. The same things come together over and over again. Like absolutely central to QAnon is this idea that the United States is run by, it's really controlled by the deep state, which is a sort of a sort of cabal within the American civil service, and that this particular cabal is it consists of Satan worshipping paedophiles. Now, this idea that the American government and other governments are controlled by Satan worshipping paedophiles, anyone who's followed the work of David Icke, as I have the misfortune of having done for several years, will have heard that will be very familiar with this idea. David Icke has been saying the same thing for a long time. David Icke didn't invent that. It goes back. It goes back further. That we've got in Britain, we have the stories of the Elm Guest House. I don't know if anybody's come across those. It's this idea that there was a particular bed and breakfast hostel there was a particular bed and breakfast establishment in London where members of the establishment, like the royal family, etc., would go and abuse young boys, for example. Complete nonsense, but it's the same sort of story which you find adapted into QAnon. Ideas of corrupt, high-ranking officials or other influential people who are sexually perverse, involved in the abuse of children, and secretly controlling everything. And the other side of QAnon, which is the idea of the heroic resistance fighting against them, that's absolutely fundamental to all of these conspiracy theories, going back long way back in time. Arguably, these ideas of child abuse, Sorry, there was somebody's microphone switched on. Which I thought someone was speaking there. Arguably, these ideas of child abuse among the conspirators can be traced back to medieval anti-Semitic beliefs about the ritual abuse of Christian children by Jews. The idea of the heroic figure fighting against them. And he's sort of conscripted in this conspiracy fantasy as the great white knight who's supposedly fighting against the evil conspiracy. That role was explicitly taken, by the way, in the 30s and 40s by Adolf Hitler. Trump doesn't claim that. Trump has never said that QAnon is real and he's actually doing this. The QAnon believers believe that he's doing that. Hitler actually styled himself as the white knight who was fighting against the terrible Jewish Masonic conspiracy. So all of this has really deep historical roots going back a long way. You've got stuff being recycled over and over again. We've got to think about who believes in this stuff. As we've seen, unfortunately, large numbers of people believe in it. conspiracy theories are they'll always be rejected by a majority of people, I think, but there's a substantial minority of people who take these things seriously enough to take action on them. There have been a number of terrorist incidents inspired by QAnon. People who thought that people who thought that they were somehow fighting against this terrible satanic paedophile cabal by carrying out or threatening to carry out violent actions. You could compare that to in the UK. I remember hearing these stories about early this year people who believed that the COVID-19 pandemic was actually it was not caused by a virus; it was symptoms caused by 5G mobile phone radiation. Now that was dismissed initially. People saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous. Let's not, don't want to discuss that." But then we actually had mobile phone masts being set fire to. Large amounts of property were destroyed. So there are people who are willing enough, who believed in this stuff strongly enough to commit crimes. We haven't had the same sort of violent. Well, there were incidents of telecoms workers being threatened and abused, but I haven't heard of any actual violence. But we've got massive destruction of property caused by multiple 5G masts being destroyed. Or in fact, much telecoms equipment that wasn't even connected with 5G got destroyed. So we can see that although people ought to be able to, I suppose I can say that people ought to be able to see through this stuff. People ought to recognize QAnon is nothing new. It claimed to be revealing some secret information, but in fact it was quite obviously plagiarizing earlier conspiracy theories going back decades and even centuries. People ought to recognise that most of the claims here are ridiculous. That this is some sort of fantasy. One of the comparisons I often draw is with I don't know how many of you are fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the Marvel movie Captain America: The Winter Soldier. The plot of it is obviously taken from conspiracy theory culture. I could go through it in some depth, but I shan't. All multiple aspects of that film are just lifted from conspiracy discussion on the internet, and it makes a good movie. But it's only a movie, and if you really watch it, it's actually quite a ridiculous movie, which sort of the plot races along and there's a lot of action. But if you think about it for even a second, none of this stuff actually makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense even in a science fiction movie, it makes even less sense in the real world. So people ought to be able to see through this stuff. But for some reason, it's attractive to a certain group of people. And we have to think about why that is and why it's been so successful in recruiting people to extremist causes throughout history. I've already mentioned Nazism. The official ideology of the Nazi Party was a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories have been used as a recruitment device by extremist organisations such as the National Front in the UK for many years. Conspiracy theories are core part of the ideology of jihadism as well. There's the idea of a conspiracy between Zionists and America, which is a conspiracy to take over the Muslim world. I think one of the reasons why these conspiracy theories are attractive is because they provide people with a sense of meaning in their lives. It's like it portrays a world in which there's terrible evil. It's terrible evil, and it's obvious how to be good. You can be good by opposing that terrible evil that you believe to be there. And of course, the real is all full of shades of grey, and we don't have the luxury of making the kind of decisions that people do in movies where there is that clear moral framework. Conspiracy theories provide people with that, even if it's an illusion. Another thing is they also provide people with a sort of sense of superiority. One of the things you notice if you look at the discussion, the discourse of people of conspiracy believers online, is the contempt with which they hold everybody else. Conspiracy believers will often refer to the rest of the human population as sheeple, for example. As far as they're concerned, we're all sheep, doing what we're told, and someday we're all going to be, like real sheep. Someday the shepherd is going to take us all off to be slaughtered.
I think the term normies has now displaced sheeple, I think.
To some extent, in certain parts of, I think normie. I think normie was always, sheeple is more of a specifically conspiracist term. Normie has been there for some time in more in the sort of right wing circles. The people who are not the ones who think of themselves as being red pilled. Sorry, that's another term. It comes from another science fiction movie, The Matrix, where you might remember Keanu Reeves takes the red pill, which enables him to see the world as it really is. People in that the red pill movement includes, it's not limited to conspiracy theories. That includes, for example, the so-called seduction community, etc., who have particular ideas about how men should initiate and conduct relationships with women. The manosphere, which is the sort of anti-feminist online circles, those terms are used quite a lot as well. But it's all of them. It's behind all of this. It's this idea of if you believe in this stuff, that makes you better than other people. You are smarter than everybody else. Everybody else is a fool. Everybody else is a dupe. Everybody else has believed these lies, but you have seen through them. And that, I think, is a very powerful motive for people for wanting to believe in this stuff. As far as the rest of the world is concerned, these things are simply too stupid, too ridiculous to believe. But as far as the believers are concerned, the problem is us, and that we are simply we're too sort of essentially we're too stupid to understand things the way that they do. So I think there's a lot of things which we've got to, when we look at QAnon, we've got to recognize all of the things that it comes out of. And this is a long tradition of very, very similar stuff that this comes out of. It's all come together right now in something that's called QAnon and that is moving into the political mainstream. But this is old stuff. This is familiar stuff. And many of us have been studying very similar things for a long time.
That's absolutely fascinating and an extremely good introduction to the issue. Daniel, one thing that did occur to me before we move on to Matthew in 1 second, while you were talking, is the amazingly interesting connection between conspiracism and popular culture. And you gave the example of The Matrix and Marvel and the way that these artifacts of popular culture have the sort of reciprocal relationship with conspiracism. And another good example of that is UFO conspiracism, which reached an absolute height when the X-Files was one of the most popular television programs in America and in the world. And its sightings of UFOs, claims of abduction, have simply evaporated since the X-Files came off the air.
Yeah, the X-Files was that's a really good example. The X-Files was it was obviously inspired by conspiracy theories on many levels. You have the heroic figure of Mulder, wasn't it?
Mulder, yes.
He was Scully was always the skeptic, and she was always wrong. Mulder was always right because he was the one who believed. So he's sort of, so it's been inspired by conspiracy theories, and it also helped to inspire a lot of conspiracist culture in its own right, and that shows you the attraction of conspiracism. Really, it's viewing yourself as Agent Mulder or Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, what his character was called, or as as Captain America or whatever. You can see yourself as a hero, which is the same. Which is, I think, is essentially that organizations recruit. They give people the opportunity to be, in their own eyes or in the eyes of the group, a hero, which is something that many people want, and which real life doesn't really offer as many opportunities for. Let's face it.
Yes, this is very true. I'm now going to move on to Matthew. Matthew, I'm unmuting your microphone. You turn your camera on.
Thank you. Am I coming through all right?
Yep, I can hear you. I can't see you yet.
Oh.
Keep talking, and you will eventually appear, I'm sure.
Sorry, technology and I have a lifetime ago.
There's a little button at the bottom that says "Start Video." Press that, and you will appear. There you are.
Very difficult to follow. I mean, that was really deep and actually a very wise summation by Dr. Allington. So I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add on the conspiracy side. Maybe what I'll do as a counterpoint is just focus very narrowly on the last 3 years. And the first point that I suppose I'd make is on the 28th of October of this month is actually the 3-year anniversary of Q. So it has become a very important destructive conspiracy theory that has yet to have 3 years in the bag. And I think one of the things that seems to me really important underlying that is obviously digital culture. I think that Dr. Allington also pointed out some of the challenges of digital literacy, because a lot of these people who are kind of getting sucked down the rabbit hole don't really, they're not double checking sources. They're not used to being systematically lied to. But what I want to do is really just trace out just a couple of highlights, lowlights really, of that 3 years, because I think that that might be an important counterpoint again to the wider point that Dr. Allington makes, that really when we talk about conspiracy theories, they're palimpsestic, right? They kind of layer upon each other. They draw upon earlier conspiracy theories. They fit into conspiratorial grooves. And I hope to come back to that. But the image that perhaps, David, if I could, maybe share with viewers is one of a volcano. And I'm going to come back to that in a second, of seeing the QAnon conspiracy as a volcano. And at the top of that volcano, where everybody goes, wow, it's so strange, it's so unusual to see this, is simply just save our children. Okay, and I think that that's a really important, like, who doesn't want to save our children? Who doesn't want to protect children? Who isn't against pedophiles and child kidnappers and so forth? So I think that, the top bit, the smoke coming out of the volcano, is something that no reasonable person is going to be against. And I think that's a really important for somebody who might just be coming across and say, I want to save our children. Okay, and I'll again conclude with that, because some of the more legitimate save our children work has been increasingly hijacked by Q. So Q starts with these drops, as Dr. Allington said, first on 4chan on the 28th of October. Okay, it's only a month later that it moves over to 8chan. And the person who created 8chan is now a whistleblower, believes that the people who are either in control of the Q account or Q themselves are a couple of Americans that are based in the Philippines. It's not confirmed, but the idea is that these aren't ideological fascists or they're simply just grifters who want to see the world burn, is the takeaway from this whistleblower. Importantly, even in this, let's call it 35 months of its existence, Q was also down for 3 months in the changeover from what was called 8chan, one of these chans, to 8kun, 8kun. And I think that was an important moment, because it really showed that Q had a degree of resilience. 3 months is a long, long time on the internet. So what I would suggest, and from there, really, in the last 11 months, we've seen it spread tremendously via Reddit, Facebook, until it was very recently, I think only in the last 2 days, banned off their platforms, but is still appearing on a number of different chans and a number of different threads. And to just bring you up to speed, the most recent Q drop from only yesterday. David, is it inappropriate for me to read this, or?
No, please do go ahead.
Okay, and so again, the top of the bit is the save our children, the almost, again, I agree with Dr. Allington, almost foolishly exotic bit. Underneath it is a much more sinister anti-government conspiracy. So the latest Q drop says this: shadow president, shadow government, information warfare, irregular warfare, color revolution, insurgency, Q. And again, I think a lot of that is in the context of the US election. I think that's a really important driver for some of the radicalization we're seeing. I just make a couple of very final points, David, if I could. The people that are eating this up, I think, don't strike me as your normal, forgive me, it's probably not a politically correct thing to say, your normal tinfoil hat brigade that believes that there was no moon landings and that, the aliens are everywhere. This isn't, at least, again, I want to suggest this is impressionistic. This isn't the same demographic. We're talking about suburbia rather than people who are kind of in the fetid swamps of conspiracy theories online. We're talking about suburbans rather than, let's say, people who are already predisposed to ideological extremism. And so once this lava starts flowing, this is where I absolutely agree with Dr. Allington. it fits into these pre-existing grooves. And these grooves are our conspiracy theories that there is a cabal of left-leaning people who are stealing children, that are Satan worshiping pedophiles, and worse. I mean, it really does get very unhinged. But part of my argument is that they're going to, in the way in which lava flows downhill, fit into pre-existing conspiratorial grooves. And just a final point, really, to bring us up to date. Again, some of these are ongoing, but there are a number of criminal and felonious Q cases going on. So I think that, again, the volcano metaphor is better than something that is sort of like, this is very cute and very exotic. Colorado mom enlisted. I'm just going to read some headlines to conclude, if you don't mind, David. A Colorado man enlisted help from the QAnon community to kidnap a child in the fall of 2019. A Texas woman tried to attack two strangers with her car because she thought they were cute. They were child predators, police said. And a final one, an Oklahoma man whose Facebook was filled with Save Our Children messaging has been accused of murdering his girlfriend's 10-month-old baby. Now, just a final point, just to kind of reiterate that we are talking about a British context. I'm going to try something that is a little bit, well, maybe it's not, because I would have tried to share my screen, David, but what maybe we can look at a little bit later is recent protests in the United Kingdom have featured under the banner of Freedom for the Children UK. And those are still available on Facebook because they're not explicitly linked to Q. But one just looks at the leader of, in this case, Freedom for Our Children UK on YouTube, and the person that she's talking with has a massive Q banner behind her. And I think that's the way in which we're seeing this kind of creep into the mainstream in the UK, rather than, as you said, maybe even as counterpoint, as you said, elbowing its way into the American primaries.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That is a very important focus for us to think about and talk about. I've got a couple of questions from Bernard Glick, who I'm going to come to in a moment. But while he works out how to switch his microphone on and things like that, a question really to both panelists. And I should say I've got pages of questions here, but one that did occur to me is, we focus a lot on the sort of suburban demographic of QAnon followers, but the danger, I suppose, is where these ideas become part of the political, the sort of broader mainstream, and that got me thinking about the. Daniel talked about the Nick Exaro conspiracism. That was something which, for whatever reason, was regarded by the police as credible and true before it was exposed as a complete pack of lies and fantasies. But you can go back further to the satanic child abuse panics of the 1980s and the 1990s, which seemed to me to be very direct precedents on this. It was something that existed before the internet, but was yet widely talked about. And as we know, in many countries, and the United Kingdom was one of them, children were taken away from their families, and in some cases, adopted out of their families and not returned because of a false moral panic about satanic child abuse. So I wonder if there's kind of a Jungian archetype here that these conspiracy theories sort of draw on, or whether there's some other explanation for it. Matthew or Daniel, interested in your thoughts?
I just have a brief observation. One thing that I think is really important about what you said, a lot of the references, in fact, do come out of that 1980s, 1990s American context. Now, that's not to disagree with Dr. Allington's point that these are long-held conspiracy theories, but a lot of the cultural references, for example, the original password for Q was Matlock, which again is a very American television show, and would, again, it's circumstantial evidence, but would give credence to the idea that these people are Americans in the Philippines of a certain age who are watching Matlock in the 1980s and 1990s, and who know about, for example, that moral panic about like hard rock bands. David, one other thing that I should say, just for the audience's benefit, because it's obvious and we all skated past it. Q is actually a top security clearance code for the U.S. Department of Energy. So, you know, an important
Yes,
context
and he's
is,
meant to have an energy department connection in the mythology
but
of
of course,
Q. Right.
but the point is that, of course, this is the person who is dropping this information for the public. There's two things there. One is that person is a highly placed, you know, top secret clearance U.S. official, and secondly, they leave the conspiracy theory, the breadcrumbs, in a way that it leaves individuals to have a degree of agency. They can crack the code. So it's not just you are, you know, kind of a passive recipient of this, but that it's a crowdsourced conspiracy theory.
Daniel, I'll come to you, and then I'll go to Bernard.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight the way that I think you're right actually in David in drawing a connection with the child sex abuse panics of the 1980s. I remember these, and they were not just in the UK. I think I seem to remember in Scandinavia there was I think Norway there was.
Well, they had actual Satanists who actually did actual crimes. That was,
yes,
you're thinking of Lord Gekirnes.
Yes. No, I wasn't thinking about that though. Back in the 80s in Norway, I think there was a case where some children, a child did a drawing which looked vaguely like a satanic ritual, and social workers and teachers raised the alarm, and the social workers found that other children could be prompted to make similar drawings, and on the basis of this, they thought that there was something terrible going on when there wasn't. So that there's all sorts of historical precedents for this stuff, but I think because you mentioned, you know, the idea of a Jungian archetype, I'm not sure if I want to make it that I want to psychologize it to that length, to that extent. But I think we can go back in terms of the cultural mythology of the mythology of Europe, going back to the medieval period. This is this idea of an enemy that is satanic. You know, this goes back to the actual witch hunts of the 16th century and earlier. We've got people being killed for the crime of witchcraft, which doesn't exist. Witchcraft is not real, and yet there were people who were actually executed for engaging in witchcraft. You have you've also at the same time as you've got this persecution of witches, you also have a persecution of heretics, punished in similarly gruesome ways, also being burned, for example. You have, of course, also the persecution of the Jews. And all of these groups are accused of very similar things. They're accused of abusing children. They're accused of worshipping the devil. They're accused of poisoning people, of having hidden influence, of carrying out murders that are covered up, etc. So we've got there's hundreds of years of background to these ideas, and I'm not sure to what extent I want to psychologize that, but it's clearly something which it's a sort of recurrent folklore in Europe and the European diaspora, in which I would include the United States.
Yes, it does. I mean, one of the things that some people have said is, this is a form of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And of course, there are aspects of Cthulhu theology that involve Soros and the Rothschilds. But it really, really does strike me as conspiracism without the Jews. I mean, remember, the original form of conspiracism is about the Bavarian Illuminati, and then the Freemasons after that. And it seems to fit very, very clearly into that sort of pattern.
I think we can draw. I think we could see. I think conspiracism comes out of. Well, there's been a lot of work showing that the continuities between medieval anti-Semitism and modern conspiracism. But I think something that's maybe missed in that is that the accusations that were made against Jews in the medieval period were so similar to the accusations made against heretics and witches. It's the same idea, and this image of the villain who is torturing and killing children, and is in league with the devil, and is opposed to and who is trying to destroy Christendom, because that was essentially the accusation against the Jews, the heretics, and the witches. They were trying to destroy Christendom, and that's why they were poisoning wells, etc., and causing plagues. I think it's sort of wider than. There's obviously a very deep connection between conspiracism and anti-Semitism, but it goes wider than just the hatred of Jews.
Very much so.
other that that Western civilization has been fantasizing about for a very long time?
I'm going to go as promised to Bernard, and then after that I'm going to go to Kaben Mohammadi. Bernard, let's hear from you. You had a couple of good questions.
Thanks. You can.
I'm going to switch my lens.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bernard.
Right. I have two questions. The first question is that whilst I recognize that conspiracism might formulate itself as a symptom of mental illness, does it necessarily work the other way? And have there been any studies indicating that conspiracism might determine a form of mental illness? Because that would inform how we deal with some aspects of conspiracism. The second question is a much more straightforward and simple one. If Trump loses the election, will QAnon lose momentum?
Okay, shall we go to you, Matthew, first?
Of course you're going to say that. I'm perhaps too much of a filthy nominalist to answer the first question with any degree of comfort, I think. I tend to prefer keeping, mental health challenges and conspiracy theories separate. I find that it is a more straightforward thing, but I'm agnostic on whether or not there's crossover. I absolutely think what Bernard has touched upon, which is the election, the upcoming 2020 election, and the effects it's going to have on Q, in addition to a number of other things, is the real, it's the real 20-star question, basically. And I think that whether Donald Trump, let's say, refuses to accept defeat, which I think is looking for, again, it seems like that's what he's gearing up to do, that would see a resurgence in Q and quite possibly leading towards acts of violence. Quite hopefully, let's say, that doesn't happen because let's say there's a landslide is being predicted now and Q goes off to the good night. I mean, that's quite possible as well. Although, again, I don't think that it would simply just cease to exist. And I tend to agree with Jacob Davey from the Institute for Security Dialogue that likens Q not my little metaphor of a volcano, but a magnet that draws in other conspiracy theories. And we have seen that, for example, on the streets of London with, 5G and anti-vaxxers and coronavirus hoaxers and so forth. And I think that because it's a master frame and those aren't, that it is very useful as a magnet for drawing in other conspiracy theories and saying, oh, we can explain the 5G mask thing. Yours is just a small part of a much wider conspiratorial history that Q can explain.
Daniel, if you were there.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
I agree with Professor Feldman there. How the US election plays out is going to have a massive effect on how Q develops from now on. We're all expecting that. The thing is, it provides. The trouble. Part of the problem here is that that QAnon provides its believers with a reason for disregarding the election result. If, as we all expect is going to happen, Donald Trump is going to lose, they will be able to blame that on the deep state. And that will legitimize, if Donald Trump tries to hang on in the White House, as there's been some suggestion he might, I don't know about that, that it would legitimize that, but it would also, I'm not sure, I don't think he'll really do that, but were he to do it, the QAnon mythology would provide a justification for it. It would we can also expect QAnon believers to call on Trump not to recognize the result of the election and to remain in the White House. Whether he actually does it or not, we can expect them to be calling on him. If he does, assuming that there is an orderly transition of power, as I think there will be. I think the US is too institutionally robust. I might be wrong, but I think it's too institutionally robust for us to see anything else happen. But on the assumption that there is an orderly transition of power, QAnon believers will feel, many of them will feel that they have a legitimate reason for arguing that that Trump is still their president and that Biden is not their president, that his presidency is not legitimate, that the election was stolen by the deep state, etc. So then we could have type groups that have been seen in America for decades. You know, the tax avoidance group, anti-tax activists, etc. of the 80s. There were far-right groups in the 80s that didn't recognise the authority of the federal government, and were carrying out bank robberies and terrorist in order to finance their terrorist activities, etc. We could see a return to this, because we might find that QAnon enables its believers to take the view that Biden is not their president, and that they are now obliged to fight for the true president who's been deposed.
So we have a large number of questions and only 15 minutes left to cover them, which is a great shame, because they are excellent questions and comments. I do recommend people read them in the chat box if they're not. I did say that I would read one of Cabin's questions, and I'm going to slightly expand on it because it's a very good question that touches on something I wanted to say. Can I ask both of you, by the way, to keep your answers short when you respond? But the first question is, does QAnon have anything to say about the Epstein scandal? And that sort of the Epstein scandal, and that sort of got my mind going about, you know, a rather important factor, which is that conspiracies do exist. You know, child sex abuse rings do exist. You know, we know that in the UK, the Liberal Party covered up the sexual abuse of children by a particular MP for many years. So that made it slightly more plausible that such things might be going on. Daniel, I'll go to you first because you're on screen for me.
I can't really add anything to that, except that the conspiracy theories have to have a plausibility. And one of the ways in which they achieve that is by reference to real conspiracies that have actually happened. Something you have to bear in mind, though, is that sort of although real conspiracies happen, they always happened, they happen all the time, they do not resemble the kind of conspiracies that conspiracy theorists propose. It's not just a conspiracy of a few people to break the law or whatever, you know, even a few dozen people to break the law. They are proposing conspiracies that would involve literally thousands or tens of thousands of people working for many years, planning things decades or centuries even in advance. And this kind of thing, there is no precedent for in history. That never happens.
Matthew, let me come to you.
I think that's...
Matthew, I can't hear you. I don't know if other people can. There may be a problem with the connection. I have another question for the panel, which I am scrabbling around to look for. Because we only have such a short time left, I'm going to ask the questions now. But the question is, what resources are available to people to help them resist conspiracy theories? And I'm thinking here of a teacher who received many, requests from parents to reassure them that their children weren't going to be taken away from them by the government if they were tested positive for COVID. That's not a specific QAnon conspiracy theory, but it's connected to one. How do members of the public, how do people who are responsible for, keeping people on the straight and narrow, combat those sorts of conspiracy theories? Daniel, let me come to you.
I think I ought to defer to Professor Feldman because he didn't get to speak because everything froze when he was answering the last question.
Yeah, it did for me as well. I thought it might just have been me, but I think it was a general systemic problem. Matthew, in that case, we'll come to you. You can say what you were saying before.
I only caught half the question, so maybe I should probably...
So let me just repeat the question. The question was, what sort of resources are there available for people out there who want to resist conspiracy theories or want to persuade other people that conspiracy theories aren't true?
I'm a bit more pessimistic about that, actually. I'm not sure if the bit that I was trying to say is there's a huge get out clause for every Q conspiracist, which is this didn't happen because they're faking out the deep state. This is a sleight of hand on the deep state. It's a really important subtext for the QAnon conspiracy theory, and it allows it to be its hermetic bubble. So if I turned around and said to you, here is something, actually, forgive me, I'm going to give you a personal anecdote. Somebody I went to high school with was on Facebook talking about QAnon the other day. And because I was swatting up for this, I said, well, tell me why you think this. And it was a debate on Facebook. And someone said the FBI has declared them a potential terrorist organization. The response, but the FBI is complicit. They're part of the deep state. They're going to be part of the problem. So I think my challenge to you, David, is how do you actually get around something that looks like a hermetically sealed chamber? If something is factually true, it's planted there by the deep state. If something is in the future and it doesn't happen, that's because people were aware of it being planted by the deep state and did a double fake out. So I'm worried that people who are that far down the rabbit hole, and there really are an increasing amount of people who are, we're seeing get separated, lose their children over this. Sorry, that's probably the wrong term to view. Divorces and losing their families and so forth because they've gone down the rabbit hole. I'm not necessarily sure how you bring those people back.
I think what I ought to say is that one of the things that we've been privileged to encounter at Quilliam in our political and personal lives are people who've been very deep down rabbit holes and suddenly have sort of moments of Damascene clarity.
Yes.
I mean, I know people who've been involved in very sort of dark organizations who've retreated from them because they've been essentially reasoned out of them. But, and this does remind me of, one of the anecdotes told in, I think, the Independent article or one of the other articles about QAnon in the last couple of weeks relates to a person who was very convinced by QAnon conspiracism and then watched debunking videos and realized that this wasn't the truth he'd been sold.
That's cheering, actually. Believe it or not, I find that cheering.
I mean, there are a couple of really good questions that I'm going to conflate, but one of them is from Chloe D, who says, do you have any advice for social media platforms to prevent the spread of QAnon and be ahead in terms of the way that they evolve? That sort of leads us on to the broader question, which is, should we know that Facebook have taken all QAnon groups, although not individuals, off Facebook. Social media companies do respond to these sorts of things by booting people off their platform, which they're perfectly entitled to do. But the question is that an effective, putting to one side whether it's improper, but is that an effective way to combat QAnon? I mean, to give a parallel example, we haven't heard much from Tommy Robinson in the last few months since he's disappeared off social media platforms. Is that always another technique an appropriate one for us to be pursuing?
My answer is yes. I mean, I defer to Daniel, but Dr. Allington, I absolutely think yes.
Daniel.
No, I agree. I agree. It is an appropriate. It is an appropriate approach to take. It possibly doesn't go far enough. I think we have to get the people who are really spreading, the people who are using these platforms as broadcasting platforms. They need to be removed and stopped from doing that. There are people with, if somebody's just talking on Facebook to a handful of friends, that's one thing. If somebody has hundreds of thousands of followers, or is the admin of a group with hundreds of thousands, then they are effectively a broadcaster or a publisher. And I think different rules have to come into play. And if they are found to be, and if these people are found to be that lead to violence, then they have to be made to stop. Just as, for example, if he calls in radio show and and they start saying something which isn't allowed, the host will cut them off, or the producer will cut them off. And Facebook and Twitter and YouTube need to start recognizing that the different rules apply when somebody is addressing an audience of tens or hundreds of thousands. But there will still, although that will make a big difference, I think it will. And Tommy Robinson's a good example of how it works. People are circulating in small groups, in groups that aren't pernicious. And there, I think it's a problem that's intrinsic to the sort of architecture of social media platforms, which is that people are able to use them to form really hermetically sealed echo chambers. You can have a group with however many people in it, and anyone who disagrees with you can throw them out of the group. And I think is the long-term problem that social media allows people to say things while preventing people from disagreeing with them or being hurt, preventing people from, and I don't. That's different than just keying off the worst offenders.
Right, and it's a very difficult thing to break into those hermetically sealed echo chambers because they are, as somebody has said, self-sealing. You know, it's a self-sealing theory about the world. It's a self-sealing culture in which anybody who challenges orthodoxy merely reinforces the conspiracism itself. I'd like to because we've only got 5 minutes left. I've got one question, which I'm afraid I'm going to be one of those moderators who says, I don't understand what this question is, but I'm guessing that Daniel might understand it. So I will at least run it past him. And then I have a final question before we conclude. The question is from Ben Gibney, and it's, what role does artificial text generators such as GPT-3 have on the impact and reach of QAnon and trying to prevent the spread of such ideas? Daniel, is that something you know about? GPT-3?
I know what that is. I'm not aware that it is, but I'm not. Yeah, there is a potential. I am aware of what that is. I'm not aware that it's used to disseminate QAnon type ideas. That's all I can say.
Okay, Ben has a link in the comments, so you and other people can follow up on that later. The final thing I really want to focus on, because we've talked about sort of things that social media platforms can do, but I am interested in the sort of steps that we can take as a culture to make ourselves collectively more resilient to conspiracy theories such as these. And, you know, there are all sorts of things that we can talk about. Education of critical skills in schools, adults as well, because, of course, you know, it's largely middle-aged people who seem to be drawn into this form of conspiracism. There is a very interesting suggestion from Michael Edwards, who says you have to start with a value system. And the value system he proposes, which he admits he's just sort of extemporized here, but strikes me as a very good one, is number one, I will test what I value, believe, and understand, especially about new ideas and historical methods, and will value science and history. I will not give credence to ideas that come from anonymous sources. I will respect difference, avoid barbarity, and follow the codes of proper conduct in public life. And I will challenge conspiracy theories. I have to say, I found that immediately attractive, because instead of it sort of putting the onus on large tech companies to do the right thing and do the right thing in an effective way, it actually puts the onus on individuals to play their part in, first of all, resisting conspiracism themselves, but also playing their role in trying to retard its spread among their own social group. Do you think there's a value in creating a sort of public culture which is alive to the risks of conspiracy theories and their prevalence, and makes a point of fighting against them? Daniel, just your thoughts. As an alternative to tech companies, sort of a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach.
I think they both have to happen. I think at the moment, the trouble is that tech companies, the way that they have set themselves up, they're doing too much to help the conspiracy theorists, so it's not a level playing field. But once a level playing field is created, I think it will be time for the rest of society to step up and actually start challenging these in a bottom-up kind of way.
And
Professor Feldman, any final thoughts from
well,
you before I say goodbye to everybody?
I really want to agree with that sentiment, and I think it's an important one. But I think that Dr. Allington has really captured it. It's a both. It's an and or rather, or it's an and rather than an or. So really, we're talking about actually a handful of tech companies that control 95% of the internet. That's Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, that's 95% of the internet. If we can see these companies act in a concerted way, so not just Facebook, but Twitter and YouTube pushing this stuff off their platforms, that leaves this kind of crap to the 5% dregs, the fringes of the internet. And frankly, I don't have a problem with that, because I don't believe that these things get stamped out and don't exist anymore. They turn into tinfoil hat ideas. The reason I have maybe just a bit of hesitancy is I'm not necessarily sure that people want to engage themselves in saying, you know what, I'm going to stamp out every conspiracy theory on Facebook. I'm not sure if I would want to do that. If somebody wants to do that, I'm all for it. I tend to think maybe as an educator, I would prefer going down the route of digital literacy. So the first of those points you mentioned about verifying sources, right? I mean, imagine where some of this sort of maybe coming full circle, the pre-QAnon conspiracy theory was Pizzagate. And rather than perhaps see, did Comet Pizza even have a basement? This guy gets in his truck, goes down with a gun, and he's holding up an entire place. Well, if there's no physical basement in the building, you might turn around and go, okay, maybe this is a bad idea. So,
right, but the fascinating thing, Matthew, is that he stepped down, he stood down when he turned up at the venue and found it didn't have a basement. So it shows that, at least even at that very latest stage, after he fired a shot, rationality was capable of diverting him from what could have been a massacre.
I'm perhaps a little bit more skeptical of rationality in people's daily lives, David, but education at the very least, and perhaps this is where Dr. Allington and I would agree, things like digital literacy, I'd ask the audience to picture whether or not they think the digital will be more or less a part of our lives in 5 years' time. I'm not sure if anybody is going to say less. And it's precisely the importance that we place on digital in our culture today that seems to me mandating a greater degree right across the board of digital literacy.
Well, that is the final comment, a slightly downbeat note on which to end, but at least there's a prospect of hope here. If we become digitally literate, if we become critical, if we encourage others to do so, then at least we are doing something to push back against the tide of insanity and conspiracism. Can I just conclude by saying what a fantastic discussion this has been, what a superb panel it's been, and really importantly, the questions from the audience have been absolutely first rate and meant that I didn't have to ask any of my questions at all. So thank you, everybody. Let me conclude, as I always conclude, by thanking the panelists, thanking the audience, and indeed asking you, if you are not members of William Circle already, please do consider joining. Thank you, everybody. See you at the next event. Take care.